They fired the man who built everything and didn't realize it until the night it all fell apart. While millions in contracts burned and executives scrambled in panic, a quietly dismissed technician sat at home making dinner for his 7-year-old daughter. He hadn't asked for revenge. He hadn't even asked for an apology. But when the call finally came at 11:47 p.m., desperate, humiliated, and 3 hours from financial ruin, there was only one person left who could save them. This is the story of Ethan Mercer, the man they threw away, the man they needed, and the night the truth refused to stay buried. If this story finds you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far it travels. The badge said maintenance, level 2, and that was enough for most people to stop looking. Ethan Mercer had worn some version of that badge for going on 6 years at Vertex Dynamics, and in that time he'd become part of the building's invisible architecture, like the fluorescent lighting overhead or the low hum of the server cooling units he personally calibrated twice a year. People walked past him in hallways the way they walked past fire extinguishers, registered, categorized, and immediately forgotten. He didn't mind. Or at least that's what he told himself on the mornings when the telling was easy. The Vertex Dynamics campus sat on the eastern edge of a business corridor that had been built during the technology expansion of the early 2000s. A cluster of glass and steel buildings arranged around a central atrium that still looked impressive in the company's promotional materials, even though half the original tenants had since relocated or dissolved. Vertex had survived and grown where others hadn't. And the people who worked there carried that survival like a kind of institutional pride. They were the ones who made it. They had the org chart to prove it. Ethan drove a 2009 Honda Accord with a broken passenger side mirror that he kept meaning to replace and never did. He arrived every morning at 6:40 a.m. Parked in the same spot on the far end of Lot C and was at his maintenance station in Sublevel 2 before the first wave of salaried employees began filtering through the lobby upstairs. He liked the building in those early minutes, the quiet of it, the feeling that things were working the way they were supposed to work before the day got complicated. His toolbox was a battered red Craftsman that he'd had since his late 20s. It held standard equipment, wrenches, meters, diagnostic cables, along with 3 items that had no business being in a maintenance kit: a dog-eared copy of Tannenbaum's modern operating systems, a spiral notebook filled with handwriting so small it required a certain kind of squinting to read, and a photograph tucked inside the front cover of the notebook. The photograph was of a little girl, 7 years old, gap-toothed and laughing, standing in front of a Christmas tree, wearing an oversized reindeer sweater that belonged to someone much taller. Her name was Lily. She was the first thing Ethan thought about every morning, and the last thing he thought about before he fell asleep, and all the hours in between were organized around the fact of her existence, the way a solar system organizes itself around its star. Not by choice exactly, but by the simple operation of gravity. He picked her up from school at 3:15, and she always ran to the car, which he knew wouldn't last forever and tried not to think about too carefully. They ate dinner together every night at the kitchen table with the television off. They read together before bed. She was working through the Third Wings of Fire book at a pace that startled her teacher. And when she fell asleep, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with his notebook and worked, the way a person does when the working itself is the only part of the day that still feels like him. That was the life. It wasn't large, but it held together. The thing about Vertex Dynamics that outsiders rarely understood was that the company's real value wasn't in its software products or its client-facing platforms. Those were the visible surfaces, the things that showed up in quarterly reports and earned the company its reputation in the industry. The real value, the thing that made Vertex genuinely irreplaceable for the 14 major enterprise clients that anchored its revenue, was a distributed infrastructure system called Core. Core stood for nothing. That was the first joke Ethan had made when he built it back in 2009, in a different life, when he was a different version of himself. He'd been 29 years old, a senior infrastructure engineer with a graduate degree from Carnegie Mellon, and a hunger for problems that no one else had solved yet. Vertex had been smaller then, 60 employees, 2 rented floors, a CEO who still answered his own email. Ethan had spent 14 months designing and building the architecture that would eventually let the company scale to handle the data loads of enterprise clients with thousands of endpoints. Core was, at its most basic level, a distributed systems backbone. But at its most specific level, it was a hand-assembled machine with layers of logic and redundancy that existed in Ethan's head more completely than they existed anywhere else. He had documented it, of course. There were binders, there were internal wikis, there were technical schematics that still live somewhere on Vertex's internal servers. But documentation tells you what a system does. It rarely tells you why someone made a specific decision in 2011 to solve a problem that didn't have a name yet. He'd left his engineering role in 2016, not by choice, though the paperwork said otherwise. His wife, Mara, had gotten sick the spring before that, the kind of sick that announces itself quietly and then takes over a room. She'd been diagnosed with an aggressive form of ovarian cancer in April, and by August she was gone, and the 4 months in between were a kind of sustained catastrophe that Ethan navigated mostly by not looking directly at any of it. He'd taken leave. He'd taken care of her. He'd taken care of Lily, who had been 2 years old and would never remember her mother's face without the help of photographs. When he came back to Vertex, the company had changed. New executive layer, new org structure, new CEO, a sharp-controlled woman named Victoria Hale, who had been brought in by the board to professionalize what had been a founder-run operation. Victoria was good at her job, Ethan would come to believe, but she had arrived into a story already in progress without knowing all the characters, and that left certain people with the opportunity to write her version of events before she could. The person who did the writing was a senior vice president named Marcus Drell. Marcus had joined Vertex 6 months before Mara died, and by the time Ethan returned from leave, Marcus had become indispensable in the way that certain political animals become indispensable, not by building things, but by positioning themselves at the center of conversations about things other people had built. He was 45, lean in the specific way of a man who spent real money on gym memberships, and he had the verbal fluency of someone who had learned early that sounding correct was frequently more useful than being correct. Ethan had recognized him immediately for what he was. He'd known men like Marcus his whole career. The recognition hadn't helped. The reassignment happened on a Thursday in March, 2 years after Ethan returned from leave. He'd been aware for weeks that something was shifting. The meetings he used to be included in stopped including him. His access credentials for certain internal systems had been quietly downgraded, Bishasu. He noticed because he noticed everything about those systems, the way a carpenter notices when something is built wrong. Twice he'd tried to raise concerns with his direct supervisor, a well-meaning operations manager named Derek Chen, who had the particular discomfort of a man caught between two forces he didn't fully understand. Marcus is reorganizing the infrastructure division, Derek told him, the second time Ethan brought it up. It's all part of the modernization initiative. What modernization initiative? Derek looked at the middle distance. The one Marcus presented to Victoria last quarter. I wasn't consulted on that. I know. Derek said it like he was apologizing for weather. The formal meeting was brief and followed the HR script so faithfully that Ethan suspected someone had actually printed it out beforehand. 2 people from Human Resources. Marcus, who sat at the end of the table with his hands folded and his expression arranged into something that was performing regret. A document that used the phrase role elimination 4 times and valued contribution 3 times. Ethan read the document without speaking. This isn't personal, Marcus said. The company's evolving. The infrastructure needs that existed 5 years ago aren't the same needs that exist today. I see. We're bringing in a specialized team, best in the industry. They'll be better equipped to handle the modern architecture. Ethan looked at Marcus for a moment. Who are they? Marcus named 3 engineers, Chen Wei, Priya Nair, and David Okafor. Something shifted behind Ethan's eyes, but his face didn't change. I know them, he said. We know. That's part of why we're confident in the transition. He knew them because he'd trained them. Not formally, not with a title and a curriculum, but in the specific way that a person trains others when they've built something and want it to survive them. Chen Wei had worked under Ethan's supervision for 2 years starting in 2013. Priya had interned at Vertex the summer of 2014 and come back full-time the year after. David had come in as a junior engineer in 2015, and Ethan had spent 6 months walking him through the core architecture because David was the kind of engineer who asked the right questions and deserved real answers. They were good. He'd made sure of that. He signed the paperwork. He cleaned out his locker in sub-level 2. He drove to Lily's school and picked her up, and when she climbed into the back seat and asked why he was there early, he said he'd had a slow day and wanted to see her. She accepted this without suspicion, which was one of the things he loved about being her father. He was still to her a man whose word was simply true. The maintenance position had come about by accident, the way most things did. 3 weeks after he was let go, Vertex's facilities manager, a rumpled, decent man named Robert Aguirre, who had worked at the company since before Ethan arrived, called him on his personal cell. "I know this is probably the last call you want to get," Robert said. "What is it, Robert?" "I've got 2 open positions in facilities maintenance. The pay is... Look, it's not what you were making. It's not close. But I could use someone who actually understands the systems in this building, and you're the best person for it." "You're offering me a maintenance job." "I'm offering you a reason to come back in the building," Robert said. "I figure you might want one." He'd been right about that, even if Ethan hadn't said so directly. The severance would cover a year, maybe 14 months if he was careful. But Lily's school was good, and the apartment was in her district, and the thought of uprooting her while she was still finding her footing felt like the wrong kind of disruption. And there was something else, something he didn't say out loud, even to himself at first. He wanted to watch, not to cause trouble, not to wait for failure. But because he'd built something that he wasn't finished understanding yet, and the idea of it existing in the world without anyone left to read it correctly disturbed him the way it disturbs a doctor to leave a patient in the hands of someone who hasn't seen the full chart. So he took the maintenance job, and he came back to the building, and he wore the badge that made people stop seeing him. And he watched. What he watched was a team doing genuinely good work on the wrong problem. Chen Wei, Priya, and David were skilled engineers. He'd made sure they were skilled, and the years since had continued the process. They arrived with energy and with the particular confidence of people who had been hired to fix something, which creates a bias toward finding things to fix. They audited the core architecture, produced a modernization roadmap, and began implementation with the kind of organized competence that looked, from the outside, like exactly what you'd want it to look like. Ethan watched from below, from hallways, from the sub-level 2 maintenance station where he calibrated the cooling units and documented things in his spiral notebook. Sometimes he crossed paths with the 3 of them in the building, at the coffee station on the 4th floor, in the parking garage, once in the lobby when Chen Wei was running to a meeting and nearly walked into him. "Oh," Chen Wei said. "Hey, Ethan, I didn't know you were still..." He stopped, reassembled. "I heard you'd come back." "Facilities maintenance," Ethan said. "Level 2. Chen Wei had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Yeah, listen, how's the rollout going?" A beat. "Good. We're making good progress." "Good," Ethan said, and moved on. He didn't blame Chen Wei for taking the job. He didn't blame Priya or David either. They'd been offered something real, and they'd taken it, and the fact that it had been made available through a process that wasn't right didn't make their ambition illegitimate. What frustrated him, what he turned over in his mind during the long quiet hours in Sublevel 2, was the specific problem they were creating without knowing it. There was a subsystem in Core that Ethan had built in 2013, during a period when Vertex was expanding its server infrastructure to accommodate a new wave of enterprise contracts. At the time, the company had been acquiring used server hardware to supplement its primary clusters, a cost-saving measure that the CFO had insisted on and that Ethan had agreed to with conditions. The condition was a thermal management protocol he designed and embedded in Core's core process scheduler. He'd called it ThermalLink internally, though it appeared nowhere in any documentation by that name. The protocol monitored heat signatures across distributed server nodes and automatically adjusted load distribution to prevent thermal cascade failures, a specific failure mode where overheating in one node pushes excess load to neighboring nodes, which then overheat in turn, propagating through a cluster like a wave. It was an elegant piece of engineering, built to solve a problem that the used hardware created and that the documentation of that period hadn't thought to flag. Over the years, as Vertex upgraded its server infrastructure and the used hardware was retired, the visible signs of the problem ThermalLink had been built to address had disappeared. By the time Chen Wei and Priya and David audited the system, ThermalLink looked like what old code often looks like: a redundant process running in the background, drawing resources, doing nothing obvious. They flagged it in their modernization roadmap as legacy overhead, recommend deprecation. He had seen the roadmap. He had access to internal documentation through his maintenance credentials, which gave him read-only visibility into certain technical repositories as part of his facilities role. When he found the deprecation note, he sat with it for a long time. He had three options. He could do nothing. He could contact Derek Chen, who had been sympathetic but ultimately powerless. Or he could go around the channels and speak directly to someone with authority. He chose, for reasons that would trouble him later, to document his concerns in his spiral notebook and do nothing else. Not because he was passive. He was the opposite of passive. Everything in his nature pushed toward solving problems, toward making the system work the way it was supposed to work. But there was something calcified in him after the years of being categorized and minimized, something that had hardened around his willingness to walk into rooms where he wasn't wanted and explain things to people who had decided not to listen. He'd tried, with Derek. He'd tried, obliquely, before his termination. And there was a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being right in a room full of people who have decided you are not. So he documented. He wrote down what Thermalink was, what it did, what would happen if it was disabled under the wrong conditions. He wrote it clearly in the precise technical language he'd used for 20 years, and he put it in the spiral notebook that lived in his Red Craftsman toolbox. And then he went home and helped Lily with her homework and made dinner and read to her before bed, and the notebook sat in the toolbox in sub-level 2, and the months passed. Spring turned to summer, and the summer that year was the kind that gets named. Not officially. Meteorologists use terms like exceptional heat event and sustained high-pressure system. But in the way people talk about it, the summer became the one where everything was wrong. Triple-digit temperatures arrived in late June and showed no sign of moving. Power grids in 3 states issued rolling strain advisories. Air conditioning repair companies were booked out 6 weeks. Ethan tracked the weather with the specific attention of someone who understood what extreme heat did to server infrastructure, and the number in the back of his mind, the threshold temperature at which Thermalink had been designed to activate, was 104 degrees Fahrenheit. On the 14th consecutive day of temperatures above 100, the forecast for the following Tuesday called for 107. He thought about the notebook. He thought about the deprecation note in the modernization roadmap. He thought about the 14 enterprise clients whose service contracts were anchored to Vertex's network uptime guarantees. He went to Robert Aguirre's office on that Thursday and knocked on the door frame. Robert looked up. "What's up?" "I need to flag something." "Okay." "It's not a facilities issue. It's infrastructure." Robert set down his pen. He was 61, 4 years from retirement, and he had the particular wariness of a man who had survived multiple reorganizations by not stepping into things that weren't his problem. But he also trusted Ethan, which was one of the small valuable things that the last few years had produced. "Talk to me," Robert said. Ethan talked. He explained Thermalink in language stripped of jargon, the way he explained technical things to non-technical people. Not simplified exactly, but translated. He explained what the deprecation would mean. He explained the forecast. Robert listened without interrupting. When Ethan was done, Robert said, "You want me to take this upstairs?" "I want someone to take it to the infrastructure team before Tuesday. Marcus runs that division." "I know." Robert was quiet for a moment. "You understand how this looks?" "I do." "A maintenance tech coming forward to tell the high-paid specialists they made a mistake." "I'm aware." Robert rubbed the side of his face. "Give me your notes. I'll see what I can do." Ethan gave him the relevant pages from the spiral notebook, 5 pages of handwritten technical documentation, precise enough to be unambiguous. He went back to his maintenance station and calibrated the cooling units in server room 2 and thought about Lily, who had a dentist appointment that Friday, and was anxious about it in the way she got anxious about small things, with a seriousness that he found both heartbreaking and completely recognizable. Robert sent him a text at 4:45 p.m. that said, "Passed it up. Was told the modernization team reviewed all legacy processes. Thanks for flagging." He read the message twice. He put his phone in his pocket. Friday, he took Lily to the dentist. She had no cavities, which she announced to him in the parking lot with the satisfaction of someone who had prepared for something difficult and come through clean. He took her for ice cream afterward, and she ordered a scoop of cotton candy and a scoop of something called birthday cake that was aggressively pink, and she ate it with the particular happiness of a child who has gotten exactly what she wanted. "Dad," she said. "Yeah, what's wrong?" He looked at her. "Nothing's wrong. You keep doing the face." "What face?" "The thinking one." She demonstrated, pulling her mouth slightly to one side and staring at the middle distance, which was apparently what he looked like when he was worried and believed himself to be concealing it. He laughed, which surprised him. "I've got work stuff on my mind." "Is work bad?" "Work is fine." She considered this with the frank evaluative gaze that she'd had since she was old enough to understand that adults said fine when things were not entirely fine. Then she went back to her ice cream, which was a kind of mercy. That night, after she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with his notebook and wrote out everything he remembered about Thermalink. Not just the technical documentation, but the context. The conversation he'd had with the facilities manager at the time about the used hardware. The thermal events he'd observed in the test environment that had made the protocol necessary. The specific calculations he'd run to determine the threshold parameters. He wrote for 2 hours, and at the end he had 11 pages that constituted the most complete single-document account of the system that existed anywhere outside his own memory. He didn't know why he was doing it. Not exactly. There was something superstitious in it. The same impulse that makes people write things down before surgery or before a long trip. If something happened and he was no longer available to explain it himself, this document would have to do the explaining. He put the pages in a manila envelope and wrote Thermalink, E. Mercer, on the outside and put it in the kitchen drawer with the extra takeout menus and the spare house key and the battery he kept meaning to put in the smoke detector. Then he went to bed. The weekend passed quietly. Lily had a sleepover at her friend Maya's house on Saturday, which meant Ethan had a day to himself that he spent doing laundry and walking to the park and eating a sandwich on a bench in the shade while the heat pressed down on everything with the indifferent authority of weather. Monday was uneventful. He did his rounds, calibrated, documented, came home, made pasta, which Lily declared adequate, which was high praise from a 7-year-old with opinions. Tuesday's forecast was 107 degrees, and it arrived early. The call came that evening at 6:12 p.m. He was at the stove when his phone buzzed with Robert Aguirre's number. He turned down the burner. "Robert." "Ethan." Robert's voice had a texture in it that Ethan recognized without being able to name exactly. The voice of a person who has just watched something they were warned about actually happen. "How bad is it?" A pause. "Network's been down 40 minutes. Whole system. They can't figure out what triggered it." Another pause. "The heat hit 107 at 4 this afternoon." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, opened them. "Who knows you're calling me?" "Nobody. I'm calling you myself." "Does Marcus know the system is down?" "Marcus is in the building, him and Victoria both. And Chen Wei's team. They've been on it since the alert fired." "Have they tried to bring core back up through the primary restart sequence?" "Twice. It restores partially, and then collapses again about 8 minutes in." That tracked. A thermal cascade failure, if that's what had happened, wouldn't respond to a standard restart because the restart sequence didn't account for the distributed heat load. You'd bring the system up, it would redistribute load to the damaged nodes, and the cascade would refire. "Ethan." Robert's voice dropped slightly. "Is this the thing you warned about?" "I need to see the error logs to be sure." "Can you come in?" He looked at the stove, looked at the hallway that led to Lily's bedroom, where she was probably reading. "Give me 20 minutes, he said. He went to Lily's room. She was on her bed with the Wings of Fire book open in her lap. He sat on the edge of the mattress. "Hey, bud, I have to go into work." She looked up. "Tonight?" "Yeah, there's a problem they need me to look at." She accepted this the way children accept the version of events that sounds most like the normal world. "When will you be back?" "I don't know. Late. Mrs. Patterson from downstairs is going to come sit with you, okay? She knows where the snacks are." "I know where the snacks are. You know too." She went back to her book, then looked up again. "Dad?" "Yeah." "Fix it." He looked at her for a moment. The gap tooth, the reindeer sweater in the photograph, the 7 years of her life that had organized his entirely. And something in his chest settled, the way a load-bearing wall settles when it knows what it's holding. "Working on it," he said. The Vertex campus was lit up when he arrived at 7:04 p.m., not festively, clinically. The kind of light that accumulates when a building full of anxious people are all running on screens at once. He could see it from the parking lot, the warm blaze of the 4th and 5th floors through the glass facade, and as he walked toward the entrance, he passed 2 people in lanyards having a fast, quiet argument that stopped when they saw him. Robert met him in the lobby. Robert looked like a man who had aged since the phone call. "Thank you for coming." "What floor is the team on?" 5, the main infrastructure lab. But Marcus is up there, and I don't know how he's going to... "I'll deal with Marcus," Ethan said. "I need access to the server room monitoring terminals first. Sub-level 2. You still have your maintenance credentials?" "Then let's go." They went down. The sub-level 2 server room was running warm. Not critically, but warmer than its normal operating temperature, which told him something. The monitoring terminals showed a cascade pattern that was almost exactly what he'd modeled theoretically 12 years ago when he was deciding whether thermalink was necessary. He looked at it for 3 minutes, cross-referencing with the current heat load data, and then he looked at the legacy process registry. The thermalink entry was gone, not disabled, removed. The deprecation had been completed and the process cleanly excised, which meant the cascade had nothing to arrest it. The system was currently in a state where every restart attempt was going to follow the same pattern: partial recovery, redistributed load, thermal cascade refire, collapse. Without an active thermal governor, the only way to bring core up was to rebuild the scheduling logic manually around the heat distribution problem. He pulled out his phone and called Robert, who was standing 10 feet away and still answered his phone. "I need a workstation with root-level access to the process scheduler," Ethan said. "And I need it without having to go through Marcus Drell to get it." "That's going to be a problem." "Who else has root access authorization?" A silence. "Victoria Hale." Ethan put his phone down. He picked up his toolbox, still the same red Craftsman, because there was something in the consistency of it that steadied him, and he walked to the elevator. The 5th floor was going to be a conversation he didn't want to have, but the system had been down for 53 minutes, and every minute of downtime was accumulating toward the contractual threshold that would trigger financial penalties severe enough to genuinely damage the company's short-term position. He had spent the better part of 3 years being invisible in this building because it was easier than being seen. Tonight the math had changed. The elevator doors opened on the 5th floor, and the noise came out to meet him. The controlled panic of a room full of smart people who cannot find the problem. And he walked into it carrying a red toolbox and 11 pages of handwritten documentation and the specific knowledge of someone who had built, by hand, the thing that was broken. He walked into the room, and the first person who saw him was Chen Wei. Chen Wei's face did something complicated. Behind him, at a standing terminal, Priya Nair looked up. And at the far end of the room, near the window that overlooked the dark parking lot, Marcus Drell turned and saw Ethan Mercer in a maintenance uniform holding a toolbox. And his face did something less complicated, something that resolved quickly into the particular expression of a man who sees a threat arriving and is deciding how to respond to it. Ethan didn't look at Marcus. He looked at Chen Wei and said, "The Thermalink protocol. Walk me through exactly when and how it was removed from the scheduler." Chen Wei stared at him. "Please," Ethan said. "I'll explain why in a minute, but right now I need the specifics." And something in the room, in the tone of it, in the weight of the question, shifted. The way a system shifts when you give it the right input, when the right variable finally enters the equation, and things that were collapsing begin, very slowly, to reorganize themselves into something that might hold. Chen Wei didn't answer right away. That was the first thing Ethan noticed. Not the noise in the room, not Marcus moving at the far end, not the ambient panic that had settled into the 5th floor like weather. He noticed the half-second delay in Chen Wei's response, the way the younger man's eyes moved sideways before they came back, which was the tell of someone calculating what version of the truth to offer. "We deprecated it in March," Chen Wei finally said. "It was flagged as legacy overhead in the modernization audit. Who made the final call to remove it?" "That was a team decision." A pause. Based on the audit findings. When in March? The 14th. We ran a clean excision over the weekend. Zero system impact at the time. Ethan absorbed this. March 14th. 4 months ago, in mild spring weather, when the server infrastructure was running 10 degrees below its summer baseline and the thermal load differential that Thermalink existed to manage was effectively invisible. Of course, there'd been zero impact. The conditions that made the protocol necessary hadn't existed yet. Okay, he said. He set his toolbox down on the nearest workstation table and opened it. From under the Tannenbaum book, he pulled the manila envelope he'd transferred from his kitchen drawer to his toolbox on the drive over. He set it to one side. Then he looked at Chen Wei again. I need root access to the process scheduler, not read-only, write access. That's... Chen Wei stopped, looked around the room. That's not something I can authorize. I know. Who can? It was Priya who answered from across the room. She'd moved closer during the exchange, and Ethan noticed she was holding a tablet showing what looked like the same error logs he'd reviewed downstairs. She was smarter than the situation was giving her credit for, and some part of him registered that even now, in the middle of everything. Victoria's in the conference room off the main hall, Priya said. She's been there the last hour. Marcus has been managing the interface between us and her. The last sentence carried something in it, a weight, a slight stress on the word managing, that told Ethan more about the dynamic in this room than anything Marcus had yet said. He looked at Priya directly, and something passed between them. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. The kind that exists between people who once occupied the same professional world and understood its specific grammar. Thank you, he said. He picked up the manila envelope and walked toward the conference room. Behind him he heard Marcus's voice, sharp and quick. Ethan! He stopped, turned. Marcus was crossing the room, and his face had settled into the expression Ethan had seen him deploy in meetings when something threatened to move outside his control. Composed, careful, with an undertone of authority that wasn't quite as firm as it wanted to appear. You don't have clearance to be in this room, Marcus said. Robert Aguirre brought me in on a facilities issue. This isn't a facilities issue. The server room is showing thermal readings that fall under my maintenance responsibilities, Ethan said. I'm here in that capacity. It was technically true. Not the whole truth, but enough of it to stand on. Marcus knew it too. Ethan could see the calculation happening, the rapid assessment of whether pressing the point would create more problems than it solved. Whatever you think you know about this system, Marcus said, lowering his voice in a way that was meant to communicate private reason, but came out as something closer to warning. Chen's team has spent 6 months reviewing it. They are the experts on record. I agree with you, Ethan said, which is why I'm going to suggest they be present when I explain this to Victoria. He turned and walked to the conference room before Marcus could respond. Chot. Victoria Hale was standing when he came in, which surprised him slightly. He'd expected her at the table, seated, controlled, managing the crisis from a fixed position. Instead, she was at the window with a phone in one hand and a paper coffee cup in the other, and when the door opened, she turned with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting for information and had run out of patience for waiting. She looked at him. The maintenance badge, the toolbox he'd set down outside the door, the manila envelope, and something moved behind her eyes that wasn't quite recognition and wasn't quite dismissal either, more like recalibration. Who are you? She said. Not rudely, just directly. Ethan Mercer. Facilities Maintenance Sublevel 2. He paused. Before that, Senior Infrastructure Engineer. I designed core. The silence that followed had a specific texture. Victoria Hale set her coffee cup on the conference table and looked at him with the particular attention of someone who had just been given a piece of information that didn't fit the picture she'd been working from. You designed core, she said. I built it from the ground up starting in 2009. I trained the 3 engineers currently trying to restore it. She absorbed this. Her face didn't do what many faces would have done. It didn't cycle through disbelief, embarrassment, confusion. It went still, which was, Ethan would think later, a sign of the kind of intelligence that serves a person well in genuine emergencies. She was filing it, not reacting to it. Marcus told me the transition team was brought in to replace an outdated legacy system, she said. They were brought in to modernize it, The core architecture wasn't outdated. Parts of the implementation had aged, and updating those parts was legitimate work. But there was a safety protocol removed in the process that shouldn't have been. And that's what caused this. I believe so, yes. I need access to the process scheduler to confirm it and to start a repair. The standard restart sequence won't work because of how the failure propagated. Each restart attempt redistributes load to compromised nodes and the cascade refires. He held up the envelope. I have documentation, technical specs for the protocol that was removed. I wrote it tonight from memory, but it's accurate. Victoria looked at the envelope, looked at him. Why are you in a maintenance role? He didn't hesitate, but he chose his words. I was removed from my engineering position 3 years ago during a restructuring. The maintenance role came through facilities. Marcus managed that restructuring. Yes. Another silence. Outside, through the glass wall of the conference room, he could see the infrastructure lab, could see Marcus standing near the door he'd just come through, watching the conference room, and behind Marcus, Chenwei, and Priya at their terminals, and David Okafor, who he hadn't spoken to yet, bent over a second workstation with the specific posture of someone who has been running the same diagnostic 4 times and getting the same wrong answer. Victoria looked out at the same scene. How long will the repair take? She said. I won't know until I'm in the system, somewhere between 2 and 5 hours. The contractual penalty threshold is 4 hours from now, she said. I know what the threshold is. Then you know we need to start. She held his gaze for another moment. He didn't look away, and he didn't try to fill the silence with anything extra, which was something he'd learned a long time ago, that the impulse to keep talking when you've said what needs to be said is usually about your own anxiety, not the other person's comprehension. I'll authorize the access, Victoria said. What do you need from me otherwise? Keep Marcus out of my way. Something moved at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. I'll manage that. He went back into the lab, and for a few seconds, the room arranged itself into the geometry of an uncomfortable situation. Marcus by the door, Chenwei and Priya at their stations, David still bent over his workstation, and Ethan crossing from the conference room with a manila envelope, and what everyone in the room was apparently going to have to accept as some form of authority, even if no one had formally declared it. Marcus started to say something. Victoria's authorizing root access to the scheduler, Ethan said, not stopping. I'm going to need a workstation, the full error log from the initial failure onward, and someone who can pull up the current thermal distribution map. A beat of silence. Then David Okafor, without looking up from his workstation, said, I've got the thermal map up. It's not pretty. Ethan went to David's station. He looked at the map, a grid visualization of server node temperatures across the distributed cluster. And it was, as David had promised, not pretty. There were 3 nodes in the eastern cluster running at temperatures that normal architecture would have automatically redistributed away from. Without Thermalink, every restart sent a portion of load back toward those nodes, which is why the partial recoveries kept collapsing. You've been trying a full system restart, Ethan said. That's the standard recovery protocol, David said. He said it neutrally, which Ethan appreciated, not defensively. The standard protocol assumes an even thermal load across the cluster. Right now you have 3 hot nodes that any load redistribution algorithm is going to route toward because the routing tables were calibrated before the heat event. The system doesn't know those nodes are compromised because the process that would tell it that is gone. David was quiet for a moment. Thermalink. You know the name. I found it in an old commit log when I was doing the audit. There wasn't much documentation. He paused. I flagged it as legacy overhead. I know, it was a reasonable call with the information you had. Priya had come closer. So, Ethan noticed from his peripheral vision, had Chenwei. Marcus was still near the door and his stillness had changed character. It had gone from controlled management to something more like watching, calculating. So how do we fix it? Priya said. Ethan pulled a stool over to David's workstation and sat down. He opened the manila envelope and spread the pages out in 2 columns, the way you spread a map. We can't just restore Thermalink by re-enabling a process. The process file was excised, not suspended, so there's nothing to re-enable. We have to rebuild the core logic manually in the scheduler. He looked at the pages, then at the screen. I'm going to walk you through it. You're going to run it, because you have the right credentials, and I'm waiting on Victoria's authorization. We need someone on thermal monitoring full-time while we work so we know if anything changes. I can do monitoring, David said immediately. Chen, Ethan said, looking at Chen Wei for the first time since he'd arrived with something more than a diagnostic question. Can you pull the complete routing table configuration? We're going to need to manually redesignate the 3 hot nodes as load restricted before we try any restart. Chen Wei looked at him. There was something in the look that was hard to characterize. Not hostility, and not quite the discomfort from the parking garage either. Something that might, in a different conversation, have been the beginning of an acknowledgement that the situation was more complicated than any of them had let themselves say out loud. Yeah, Chen Wei said. I can do that. Priya sat down at the adjacent workstation. Tell me where to start. Das. Victoria's authorization came through 11 minutes later, a direct credentialing update that appeared in the system without announcement. Ethan confirmed it, checked the access level, and then turned to the 11 handwritten pages with the focused attention of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and is finally in the room where it can be set down. He started talking, not presenting, talking. The way an engineer talks when the problem is real and the time is short and the audience is capable. He explained the thermal cascade mechanism the way you explain something when you built it, with specificity, with the context of why each decision had been made, with the honest admission of where the design had limitations. Priya took notes. David watched the thermal map and called out numbers at intervals. Chen Wei worked through the routing table with a concentration that blocked out everything else in the room, and Marcus watched from the door. Ethan was aware of him the whole time, a presence at the edge of his attention that he kept managing, kept allocating the same minimal portion of his awareness to the way you keep track of a sound you can't identify. Marcus hadn't left. He hadn't intervened. He was watching the dynamic in the room shift in real time, and whatever he was thinking, he was keeping it contained. The work itself was hard, not impossible. Ethan had the architecture in his head the way a musician has a piece they've played 10,000 times, not as a sequence of steps, but as a complete shape, but hard in the way that precision work is hard when you're running it verbally against the clock. Twice, he stopped mid-explanation to recalculate something, working in the spiral notebook with a pen from his toolbox while Priya waited at the terminal. Twice he redirected a path he'd started down because the current state of the system differed from what he'd expected. This section here, Priya said at one point, pointing at something on her screen, the load balancer configuration. It looks like it was updated since the original specs. It was, Chen Wei said without looking up. We modified it in April, part of the modernization. How was it modified? Ethan said. Chen Wei explained. It was a reasonable modification, made without any knowledge of Thermalink or what its removal would mean, and the modification had a specific consequence for how the rebuilt protocol would need to interface with the scheduler. Ethan sat with it for 40 seconds, long enough that Priya asked if he was okay, which he acknowledged with a gesture, and then worked out the adjustment in his notebook. It actually simplifies one part of the rebuild, he said. The threshold trigger can be set as a direct parameter instead of a derived value. That's cleaner. Oh, Chen Wei said. And then, after a pause, that's actually good. It was such a small thing, that acknowledgement, and yet it changed the texture of the room slightly. Not into warmth, not into resolution, but into the particular functional dynamic of people who are working the same problem and have decided temporarily to be honest about that. David called out from the thermal monitoring station. Eastern cluster node E7 just ticked up another 2 degrees. How far from threshold? Ethan asked. 6 degrees. At the current rate, 12 to 15 minutes. Ethan looked at Priya's screen. How far are you in the load restriction redesignation? Chen? 2 minutes, Chen Wei said. Prioritize E7 and the 2 adjacent nodes, Ethan said. We need those restricted before we move to the scheduler rebuild. Chen Wei moved faster. Priya pulled up a secondary view to confirm the routing changes as they propagated. David called out temperatures at 30-second intervals, his voice steady and rhythmic, a kind of auditory metronome for the work. Outside the windows of the 5th floor, the city was dark except for the commercial lighting along the corridor, The gas stations and the chain restaurants and the office parks. And above it all, the sky had the particular flat quality of a summer night that hasn't cooled, heat still stored in concrete and glass, radiating back up into an atmosphere that has no interest in absorbing it. 107 degrees at 4 in the afternoon. Ethan thought about the forecast he'd tracked for weeks, thought about Robert's text message, was told the modernization team reviewed all legacy processes, thought about the spiral notebook and the 5 pages he'd pulled from it, and the decision, quiet and unresolved, that had kept him from pushing harder. He didn't spend long on it. There was no useful version of that accounting that could happen right now, and he'd learned enough about himself to know that the way he dealt with the things he couldn't undo was to stay in the present moment of whatever needed doing. Node restrictions are in, Chenwei said. Confirming propagation, Priya said. Looks good. E7 is showing reduced load allocation. David, temperature on E7 stabilizing. Still high, but not climbing. Good, Ethan said. Okay, scheduler rebuild. Let me walk you through the first layer. Marcus left the room at some point during the second hour. Ethan registered the departure but didn't watch where he went, and no one in the working group commented on it. The room had settled into a rhythm by then. The kind that forms when people have been at something long enough together that the social awkwardness burns off, and what's left is just the work and the shared purpose of making it come out right. Priya was quicker than he'd expected, which was probably unfair of him. She'd been a good engineer at 22 and had presumably not become worse in the years since. She anticipated his instructions on the second or third iteration of each subsystem, and twice she caught something before he said it. You're writing to the wrong scheduler layer, she said, about 90 minutes in, and then stopped herself. Sorry, I think, is that right? The load monitor needs to sit above the resource allocator, not below it. He looked at what she'd flagged. She was correct. You're right, he said. Good catch. She looked slightly startled, as if she'd expected him to push back. Then she went back to typing. The thing about working with people who are genuinely capable, Ethan had always found, was that it asked something of you. It asked you not to need to be the smartest person in the room. You could be the person with the most specific knowledge and still benefit from someone else's eyes on your blind spots. He'd understood this at 30. He wasn't sure he'd fully understood it at 25, which probably explained some of the friction from his earlier years at Vertex that he still occasionally returned to. Chenwei finished the routing work and came over to watch the scheduler rebuild progress, and after a while he started asking questions. Not challenging questions, genuine ones, the kind that come from someone trying to understand a system rather than contest it. Why did you put the cascade interrupt at this layer instead of higher up? Chenwei asked, pointing at something in Ethan's notes. Resource efficiency, Ethan said. If you put it higher up, it has to evaluate on every cycle. Down here it only fires when the thermal threshold is approached. In normal operation, it sits there doing essentially nothing. So it looked like overhead when we audited it. Yes. But it was actually the whole point. Yes. Chenwei was quiet for a moment, then. Yeah. I should have looked at that more carefully. You didn't have enough context, Ethan said. The documentation didn't explain why it was built that way. You didn't document the reasoning. No, Ethan admitted. I didn't do that well. It was true. He hadn't documented the reasoning because in 2013 the reasoning had felt self-evident to him, and the things that feel self-evident are the things you forget to write down. That was a failure on his part. A specific, concrete failure that had contributed to this night, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Chenwei seemed to register that this wasn't a deflection. He nodded slowly. Okay, he said. What do you need from me now, Stutz? At 2 hours and 22 minutes into the work, Robert Aguirre appeared in the doorway. He looked at the room. At Ethan at the workstation, at Priya and Chenwei flanking him, at David on the monitoring station. And his expression was the exhausted relief of a man who had been right about something and found no satisfaction in it. How are we doing? He said. Scheduler rebuild is about 60% complete, Priya said. If nothing else goes sideways, we should have a test restart ready in about an hour. How long till the penalty threshold? 2 hours and 8 minutes, Victoria Hale said. She was behind Robert in the doorway. She'd changed. Not her clothes, but her posture, which had shifted from the controlled tension of 2 hours ago into something more angular, more awake. She came into the room and looked at the workstation screens with the focused attention of someone who couldn't read all of what she was seeing, but was determined to understand the shape of it. "Walk me through where we are," she said to Ethan. He did. 3 minutes, clear and direct, no unnecessary technical language. She asked 2 questions, both good ones. He answered them. And the restart attempt. "When we do it, what are we looking for?" The system comes up cleanly and holds for more than 10 minutes without the thermal cascade refiring. If it collapses again, we have a problem I haven't identified yet. What are the odds of that? He thought about it honestly. If the rebuild is correct, and the thermal situation doesn't worsen, good. Better than 70%. That's not 100%. No, it's not. She held his gaze for a second. Okay. She looked at the room, at the team, at the monitors, at the yellow light of the workstation screens, and whatever she was going to say next was interrupted by her phone, which she pulled out and looked at and put to her ear. She walked to the corner of the room for the call, and Ethan went back to work. From where he sat, in fragments, he could hear pieces of the conversation. Not the words, but the cadence, which went from controlled to slower and more deliberate in a way that suggested Victoria was hearing something unexpected. Once he caught the name Marcus, used in a tone that carried weight, he didn't listen harder. He went back to the scheduler rebuild. The thing about this kind of work, deep systems repair, the kind where you're essentially reconstructing logic from memory in a live environment, was that it required a specific kind of attention that excluded most other things. Not a narrow attention, but a sustained one, a willingness to hold the whole architecture in your head while addressing specific local problems, to keep the map available while working on individual roads. He'd always found it easier than people expected and harder to explain than people expected too. The best description he'd ever managed was that it was like reading a novel backward while writing the next chapter forward. You had to know where everything had been in order to know where anything was going. He worked. Priya worked beside him. David called out temperatures. Chenwei cross-referenced routing tables and caught 2 configuration inconsistencies that would have caused problems in the restart. Outside, the city continued in its indifferent way. Somewhere across town, Lily was asleep in her room, with the Wings of Fire book probably still open on her bed, because she always fell asleep before she remembered to close it. Mrs. Patterson would have turned out the light. He let himself think about that for exactly as long as it took to verify a scheduler entry, and then he put it away. At 3 hours and 40 minutes, something changed in Marcus Drell's behavior that Ethan would only fully understand later. Marcus had come back into the room about 20 minutes after he'd left. He'd positioned himself near the conference room door again, and he'd stayed quiet, watching, occasionally checking his phone with a frequency that registered even peripherally as significant. 3 hours ago, his stillness had read as control. Now it read as something else. Victoria finished her phone call and came back to the room. She stood near the window for a moment, her back partially to the group. Ethan watched her without obviously watching her. The slight set of her shoulders, the deliberate quality of how she turned back around, the thing that happened in her face when she looked across the room and found Marcus. The look lasted less than 2 seconds. Then she looked at Ethan. "How much longer?" she said. 40 minutes to complete the rebuild. Then we test." She nodded. She didn't look at Marcus again, but the room knew something had shifted. Even in the concentration of the technical work, even under the pressure of the clock, people perceive the change in the atmospheric pressure of a room when the balance of power adjusts. Priya's typing didn't change tempo, but she glanced once in Victoria's direction. David turned back to his monitor a fraction too quickly. Chenwei simply kept working, but Ethan noticed he'd stopped looking toward the door. Marcus, from his position near the conference room, said, "I want to be clear that any actions taken tonight are subject to review through proper—" "Marcus?" Victoria's voice was quiet, completely flat. "Not now." He stopped. The word "now" did a lot of work in that sentence. Ethan had heard executives use that word before, and the versions that carried weight were not the loud ones. They were the quiet ones, the ones delivered without anger, the ones that sounded like a door closing rather than a door slamming. Victoria Hale spoke it like a door closing. Marcus said nothing further. Ethan turned back to the workstation. Okay, he said to Priya. Next layer. I'll check. At 4 hours and 17 minutes since the initial failure, at 11:43 in the evening, with 37 minutes remaining before the contractual penalty threshold, Ethan looked at what had been built on Priya's screen and said, I think we're ready. Nobody moved for a second. We need to run a pre-check on the node restriction status, Chenwei said. Already up, David said. All 3 hot nodes showing stable restriction. E7 has actually dropped 4 degrees in the last 40 minutes. Thermal trajectory on the cluster generally? Flat. Heat outside has dropped to 91. The building's HVAC is catching up. Ethan looked at the thermal map, looked at the scheduler rebuild, looked at the 11 handwritten pages on the table beside the workstation, several of which had notes and adjustments scrawled in the margins where the work had diverged from his original documentation. He looked at Priya. You read. She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, he realized, but actually evaluating. Running it in her head the way a careful engineer does before they commit. I think it's right, she said. The load monitor placement is clean, the cascade interrupt threshold parameters match the thermal data, and the interface with Chen's April modifications is solid. She paused. I would have done layer 2 slightly differently. I'd have put a secondary tripwire in the event of a partial thermal sensor failure, but that's a refinement, not a fix. What we've got should work. The secondary tripwire is a good idea, Ethan said. Write it down. We add it after the system is back up. She wrote it down. He looked at Victoria, who had been standing near the window for the last 30 minutes. She nodded, once, which wasn't permission exactly, but was the thing that functioned as it. Initiating restart sequence, Priya said. The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when the thing everyone has been working toward is finally happening, and there is nothing left to do but watch. David stared at his thermal map. Chenwei had both hands on his keyboard and no commands ready to type. Robert, near the door, had his hands in his jacket pockets and his jaw set in the expression of a man who has spent too many years watching things that were out of his control. The system came up. It came up in stages, which was normal, expected, the standard restart sequence proceeding through its layers, and every transition point was a small held breath. The cluster nodes initialized, the load balancer activated, the scheduler came online. Then the new thermal link logic fired for the first time. On David's thermal map, the load distribution adjusted, visibly, in real time, a ripple across the cluster as the rebuilt protocol read the heat signatures, identified the compromised nodes, and restricted them with the same precise logic that Ethan had written into its predecessor 12 years ago. Load distribution is clean, David said. His voice was careful, as if he was afraid saying it too definitively would change it. Scheduler running nominal, Priya said. No cascade event in the eastern cluster, Chenwei said. Temperatures are holding. The seconds passed. 1 minute, 2. The system held. At 3 minutes, David exhaled audibly and immediately seemed embarrassed about it, which under other circumstances would have been funny. At 5 minutes, Victoria Hale said quietly, to no one specifically. How do we look? Stable, Priya said. Everything nominal. Client connections? Restoring. We're going to need another 10 to 15 minutes for all the client nodes to resync, but the infrastructure is up. Victoria looked at the clock on the wall, an analog clock, the kind that still exists in office buildings that haven't gotten around to replacing them. She looked at it for a moment, then back at the room. 32 minutes to threshold, she said. We'll make it, Priya said. The room had the particular quality of exhaustion mixed with relief, and those two things don't mix cleanly. They produce a texture that is something like the hours after an accident when you know everyone is going to be okay and your body hasn't gotten the message yet. People moved, but carefully. David kept watching his monitor. Chenwei started a documentation file, which struck Ethan as exactly the right instinct. Ethan sat back on his stool and looked at the workstation screen and thought about the manila envelope with the 11 pages, some of which would need to be updated now to reflect the adjustments they'd made. He thought about the spiral notebook in his toolbox. He thought about Lily, asleep on the other side of the city, probably with her book still open on the bed. He thought about the morning, which was going to arrive with questions that the night had not resolved, and the knowledge that whatever came next, whatever conversation Victoria Hale was building toward, Whatever was happening between her and Marcus in the hours to come, he would navigate in daylight, after sleep, on terms that felt like his own. The system ran. The thermal map stayed flat. The client nodes began reconnecting one by one like lights coming on in a neighborhood after a storm. And the clock on the wall moved toward midnight with 32 minutes still to spare. The client nodes finished resyncing at 12:04 in the morning. David called out the final count. All 14 enterprise accounts showing stable connections, all uptime monitors green, all contractual obligations intact with 28 minutes to spare. And then he leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of someone who has been holding their breath for 4 hours and is only now remembering that breathing is optional. Nobody celebrated. That was the thing Ethan noticed. In a movie, there would have been something. Handshakes, exhaled laughter, someone saying, "We did it," in a voice that made the words feel earned. What actually happened was quieter and more complicated. Priya saved her work and started a system log entry. Chenwei continued the documentation file he'd opened during the restart. David began running a full thermal diagnostic to establish a post-event baseline. The work produced more work, the way it always did. And the people in the room moved into it because moving was easier than stopping and feeling the full weight of what the last 4 hours had been. Ethan gathered his pages from the workstation table. He straightened them against the surface, creased side down, and slid them back into the manila envelope. He closed his toolbox. He did these things in the particular order he always did them. Methodical, unhurried. And when he was done, he sat for a moment and let himself be still. His back hurt. He was 51 years old and had spent 4 hours on a rolling stool bent toward a workstation, and his lower back was registering its objection in the specific dull way of muscles that have been asked to do more than they were prepared for. He pressed 2 fingers against the spot and breathed. "Ethan." He looked up. Victoria Hale was standing near the workstation, and she had a different quality about her now than she'd had when he'd first walked into the conference room. Something had come loose in her composure, not unraveling it, but allowing a version of herself that existed below the management layer to be briefly visible. She looked tired. She also looked like someone carrying a weight she hadn't been carrying 3 hours ago, which told him that whatever she'd learned from that phone call during the repair work was still sitting with her. "The system is stable," she said. It wasn't quite a question and wasn't quite a statement. "For now. You'll want someone monitoring through the night. The heat outside will drop further, which helps, but I'd keep a watch on the eastern cluster nodes until morning. I'll have David stay on it." The secondary tripwire Priya mentioned, the one for partial thermal sensor failure, that should be added tomorrow, not deferred. It's not urgent, but it closes a gap. Victoria nodded, writing nothing down, which meant she was the kind of person who retained things without the crutch of notation. "I'll make sure it's scheduled." He started to stand. His back protested. "There are things I need to discuss with you," she said. "Not tonight, but soon." He looked at her. "Okay. Tomorrow afternoon, if you're available." He thought of his calendar, which had nothing on it that couldn't be moved, which was a specific kind of loneliness that he'd gotten used to. "I'm available." She held out her hand, which surprised him. Not the gesture itself, but the timing of it, the deliberateness of it, at this particular moment. He shook it. "Thank you," she said. "I mean that without any of the qualifications that usually come with it." He didn't know exactly what to do with that, so he said, "The team did the work. I just knew which direction to point them." She let that stand without arguing it, which was probably the right call given that they were both too tired for false modesty or accurate modesty to mean much. He picked up his toolbox and walked out. The hallway outside the infrastructure lab was empty. The building at this hour had its own particular atmosphere. The cooling systems running, the emergency lighting strips along the baseboards casting a low amber tone, the sound of the city outside reduced to almost nothing. Ethan walked toward the elevator and pressed the button and waited. And while he waited, he looked at the floor of the hallway and thought about nothing specific, which was a kind of luxury. The elevator opened and Marcus Drell was inside it. Ethan had known, on some level, that this was going to happen before the night was over. Not necessarily in an elevator, not necessarily at 12:20 in the morning, but the conversation, or whatever version of a conversation Marcus intended this to be, had been accumulating since the moment Ethan walked into the 5th floor. Marcus had spent 4 hours watching it not go the way he needed it to go, and men like Marcus didn't absorb that kind of event passively. He was standing against the back wall of the elevator with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he looked, for the first time that Ethan could remember, like a man who had lost something and knew it. Ethan stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Marcus said, "That was a good thing you did tonight." Ethan looked at the numbers above the door. "The team did the work." "Don't do that." He looked at Marcus. "Don't deflect," Marcus said. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know what happened in there, and I'm not going to pretend I don't know why you're here in a maintenance uniform instead of running that division. So don't deflect." Ethan said nothing. "I made a business decision," Marcus said. The word business did a lot of carrying in that sentence, more than it could support. "I needed a division I could build my own way. You were associated with the old structure, the optics of keeping you in an engineering role while bringing in a new team. Marcus," Ethan's voice was level, "I know what you did. You don't need to characterize it for me." Marcus looked at him, not the look of confrontation that Ethan had expected, but something rawer than that. "What do you want me to say?" "I don't want you to say anything." "You want an apology?" "I want to go home." The elevator opened on the lobby. Ethan stepped out. Marcus didn't follow immediately, and for a moment Ethan stood in the empty lobby with the amber glow of the emergency lighting and the glass doors showing the dark parking lot outside, and he heard Marcus say something from inside the elevator, almost too quiet to catch. He turned. "She knows," Marcus said. "Victoria. She knows everything." His voice had the quality of a man reporting weather. Flat, informational, stripped of the usual packaging. "I don't know exactly what she knows, but she got a call tonight. Someone sent her documents." Ethan looked at him. "What documents?" "The restructuring records. The original engineering evaluation I had filed before your removal. The version that said you were essential personnel and couldn't be replaced without significant infrastructure risk." The lobby was very quiet. "There was an original evaluation that said that," Ethan said. "Yes." "And it was changed. The language was adjusted before it went to Victoria's predecessor." Marcus said it with the flatness of someone describing something that had already moved past the point where characterization did any good. "It was changed to reflect that the role was eliminatable, that the modernization would cover the function. You changed it." He didn't answer directly, which was an answer. Ethan looked at him for a long time, long enough that Marcus had to do something with his hands. He put them in his pockets, which was a gesture that read as smaller than Marcus usually allowed himself to look. "Why are you telling me this?" Ethan said. "Because you're going to find out tomorrow regardless. And because—" He stopped, started again. "Because you came in tonight and fixed what I broke, and you didn't have to, and I'm not going to pretend that doesn't mean something." The elevator doors, which had been held open by Marcus's presence, began to close. He stepped out. "For what it's worth," Marcus said, "I didn't think the system would fail. I genuinely believed Chen's team could manage it." "I know you did," Ethan said. "That's not the part that was wrong." He turned and walked toward the glass doors. He pushed through into the night air, which was still warm, 90 degrees at nearly 12:30, the heat not yet surrendering. And he walked across the empty parking lot to his 2009 Accord with the broken passenger side mirror, and he put his toolbox in the trunk, and he got in and sat for a moment before starting the engine. He didn't feel what he expected to feel. He wasn't sure what he expected. Relief, maybe, or the specific vindication of a person who has been proved right in a situation where being right had cost them something real. But what he felt instead was something more like fatigue with a wide bottom. A tiredness that went beyond the physical back pain and the 4 hours of concentrated work into the longer accumulation of years of being in this situation, years of navigating a version of himself that the building had decided to assign him. He started the engine, checked his phone. There was a text from Mrs. Patterson. "She's asleep. All good. Take your time." He drove home through empty streets. He got 4 hours of sleep, which was 3 more than he'd expected. He woke at 7 to the sound of Lily in the kitchen, which was not an unusual sound. She was an early riser in the specific way of children who have somewhere to be in their own internal schedule, regardless of what the day actually holds. He lay for a moment and listened to the sounds. The refrigerator opening, the particular sound of the cereal box, the chair pulling back from the kitchen table. He got up. She looked up when he came in, and her expression did the thing it sometimes did in the mornings. A brief, complete assessment, the way children read faces before adults have had the chance to compose them. "You fixed it," she said. "Yeah." "Did you sleep?" "A little." She looked at him for another second, then went back to her cereal. "Mrs. Patterson made me brush my teeth twice. She said once wasn't enough." She was right. "I know. I just wanted you to know it happened." He sat across from her and poured himself coffee from the pot she had, somewhat impressively, started correctly, and they sat together at the kitchen table in the morning quiet, and he looked at her, the gap tooth, the serious face over the cereal bowl, the 7-year-old certainty with which she navigated the world. And something in his chest settled into the particular rest that her presence always produced in him. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "If you fixed it, why do you still look worried?" He considered several versions of an answer and selected the most honest one available to a parent at 7 in the morning. "There's more stuff to deal with. The fixing part was just one part." She thought about this with the concentrated attention she gave problems she found genuinely interesting. Like when I fix the thing with Maya, and then there's still the thing with the homework. Exactly like that. "That's annoying." "It is," he said. She finished her cereal. He finished his coffee. Outside the kitchen window, the morning was already bright and building toward hot. The sky, the flat white of another day that would climb toward triple digits by noon. He showered and changed and drove Lily to the day camp she attended through the summer. A STEM program at a community center 3 miles away that she'd chosen herself from a catalog, which had told him something about who she was becoming. He watched her run inside without looking back, which was a thing that still registered somewhere specific in him, even though he'd been watching her do it all summer. Then he drove to Vertex Dynamics. Upboat. He arrived at 8:45. The campus looked different in daylight after the night's events. The same glass and steel, the same landscaping, but inhabited differently. The parking lot filling with people who didn't know yet what had happened. The lobby rotating with the ordinary morning traffic of a company going about its business. He parked in Lot C, the same spot, and went in through the main entrance instead of the maintenance entrance, which was a small and deliberate choice. The lobby security guard, a young woman named Tanya, who had worked there for 2 years and who Ethan had fixed the break room microwave for twice, looked up when he came in and then did a very slight double take that was so subtle it was almost invisible. He was wearing the same badge. He was not wearing his maintenance uniform. "Morning," she said. "Morning, Tanya." He took the elevator to the 5th floor. The infrastructure lab was quieter than it had been at midnight, but not empty. David Okafor was still there. Almost certainly had been there all night, slumped in his chair with a nearly empty coffee cup and the thermal monitoring screen still up in front of him. He looked up when Ethan came in and blinked slowly, the way people blink when they're running on insufficient sleep and environmental stimuli. "You're back," David said. "How's the system?" "Stable all night. Eastern cluster temps have been declining since about 3 a.m. Outside temperature hit 78 an hour ago." "Good." Ethan looked at the screens, everything reading nominal, the thermal map even, the node restriction protocols holding. "The secondary tripwire. Did Priya write up the specs?" "She sent them to me before she left, about 4 a.m. David rubbed his eyes. "She also... Look, I don't know if this is the right time, but she wanted me to tell you that she's sorry. Not about the Thermalink thing specifically. She said you'd covered that. Something else." Ethan looked at him. "She didn't explain. She just said to tell you." David shrugged slightly. "I'm just the messenger." He thought about what the apology might mean, the specific texture of it, what Priya understood about the last 3 years that she hadn't said directly, and was now conveying at one remove through a half-asleep engineer at 8:45 in the morning. He thought he understood it, and he thought that it mattered more than it would have been comfortable to admit. "Tell her thank you," he said, "for last night. She was the better half of that repair." David smiled, which was the first uncomplicated expression Ethan had seen from anyone in this building in a long time. He left David to the monitoring and went to find Robert Aguirre. Robert's office was on the 2nd floor, A small room with the permanent atmosphere of a place where practical problems come to get solved. Stacks of work orders, a whiteboard with a running list of building maintenance items, a dying plant on the windowsill that Robert had been meaning to replace for 2 years. He was at his desk when Ethan came in, and he looked up with the expression of a man who had not slept either and was compensating with aggressive coffee consumption. "Sit down," Robert said. Ethan sat. "Victoria's assistant called me at 7:30. She moved your meeting to 10 o'clock. Wants it in the main conference room on 6. "Okay. That's not the facilities conference room. That's the executive conference room." Robert let that sit for a moment. "The one where the board presentations happen." "I understood you." Robert leaned back in his chair. He was 61, 4 years from retirement, and he had the face of someone who had paid close attention to this building for a long time and had specific thoughts about what he'd witnessed. "You knew about Thermalink for months," he said, "since before it was deprecated." "Yes." "You tried to report it. I gave you the notes. You passed them up. And it went nowhere." Robert said this without accusation, just acknowledgement, the kind that carries its own quiet weight. "Marcus buried it." "Probably." "I should have pushed harder." "You did what you could." "No." Robert shook his head. "I did what was easy. There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment. 4 months, Ethan. That protocol was gone for 4 months before last night. We were lucky the heat didn't hit those numbers in June. June was mild this year. Yeah, June was mild. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "What are you going to do?" "About what?" "Victoria wants you in the executive conference room at 10. That's not a maintenance debriefing." Ethan looked at the dying plant on the windowsill. It was a pothos, which were nearly impossible to kill, which made Robert's achievement with this one somewhat impressive. "I'm going to go to the meeting and see what she says. And if she offers you something, I'll think about it." Robert made a sound that was approximately a laugh. "That's fair." He set down his coffee cup. "For what it's worth, and I know I don't have any right to an opinion here after everything, you kept this place running for years when nobody knew you were doing it. That's not nothing." Ethan looked at him. "I know that. I just wanted to say it out loud." "I appreciate it, Robert." He stood, his back still hurt. He was going to need to do something about that eventually. A chiropractor probably, or at minimum a better chair in sub-level 2, which was a thought that had an odd echo given the circumstances. He went to get more coffee and wait for 10 o'clock. What? At 9:15, Chenwei found him at the 4th floor coffee station. Ethan was standing at the counter, not sitting, because sitting made his back worse. He heard Chenwei coming before he saw him, the particular cadence of someone who has located the person they're looking for and is managing the walk over, calibrating how to begin. "Hey," Chenwei said. "Hey." Chenwei poured himself coffee, stood beside him at the counter. There was a moment of the specific discomfort that exists between two people who have a history that requires acknowledgement, and neither of them has yet decided exactly how to do it. "Last night," Chenwei said. "You don't have to—" "I want to." He turned his coffee cup in both hands, which Ethan recognized as a gesture of Robert's, and then decided was probably just a building-wide habit. "When you came in and asked me about Thermalink, my first reaction was, I'm not proud of this. My first reaction was to be defensive, because the audit was thorough. We did good work on that audit." "You did, and still missed it." He said this not with self-pity, but with the matter-of-fact quality of someone conducting an honest assessment. "Because the documentation didn't give us what we needed. I know, that's on me. Maybe. But the other thing," he stopped, "seemed to be deciding something. I knew you were in the building. I knew about the maintenance position, and I never asked you about the system. In 2 years, I never came down to sub-level 2 and said, hey, you built this. Is there anything we're missing? I didn't do that because it would have been awkward, and I let awkward matter more than it should have." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "To be fair," he said, "I could have knocked on your door too. You tried to warn us." I gave Robert 5 pages of handwritten notes and let it go when he said it had been passed up. That wasn't sufficient. Chenwei looked at him. "Why didn't you push harder?" It was a fair question and deserved a fair answer. Ethan thought about the right way to say it. I'd been told in fairly clear terms that my understanding of the system was no longer considered relevant. After a while, you start to believe the version of yourself that the building reflects back at you, even when you know better. Chenwei was quiet. That's also on me, Ethan said. Not just on Marcus or the restructuring. I made choices about how much to fight and how much to let go, and not all of those choices were right. Yeah. Chenwei exhaled. I've been doing this thing in my head since last night, where I try to figure out where my responsibility in this starts and ends, and I keep running into the fact that I benefited from a situation that wasn't fair. I took a position that was created by pushing you out, and I knew, somewhere, that it wasn't entirely clean, and I let myself not think about it too carefully. You were 28 years old and someone offered you a senior engineering role. I was 30, and it's not an excuse. It's not an excuse and it's also not a crime, Ethan said. You can hold both of those. Chenwei looked at him with an expression that was hard to read, something between relief and the specific discomfort of a person who had expected more difficulty and isn't sure what to do with the absence of it. What happens now? He said. With you and the company. I have a meeting at 10. With Victoria. Yes. Chenwei nodded. He seemed to want to say something else and then decided against it, which was probably the right call. He finished his coffee. He said, For what it's worth, there's no version of last night that works without you. Not the knowledge, not the way you ran it. None of us could have done that. Ethan picked up his own cup. The secondary tripwire was Priya's idea. Chenwei smiled. A real one, tired and complicated and genuine. Of course it was. He was at the elevator bank at 9:55 when Marcus Drell came around the corner. The morning had apparently done something to Marcus. He'd slept, or tried to, and changed clothes, and the version of him that appeared in the hallway was surface composure, the practiced presentation, but underneath it the same exposed quality that had been in his voice in the elevator at midnight. Ethan. He stopped. I know you have the meeting, Marcus said. I'm not going to... He gestured vaguely. I'm not blocking anything. I didn't think you were. Marcus looked down the hallway, then back. I told you last night that someone sent Victoria documents. I want you to know, in case it matters, that I don't know who sent them. I genuinely don't know. Okay? That's all? He paused. That's all I wanted to say. Ethan looked at him. There was something almost archaeological about Marcus this morning. The careful surface over something that had been disturbed, and below the disturbance, the foundational shape of a person who had made decisions that served himself and had found a way to live with them until the night when he couldn't anymore. Ethan didn't feel charitable toward him exactly, but he also didn't feel the specific active anger he might have expected, which was its own kind of information about himself. Marcus, he said. Marcus looked at him. Whatever happens next, the documentation, the evaluation that was changed, all of it, I'm not going to spend energy on it beyond what's necessary. I'm not going to build a case or advocate for consequences. I'm going to go to this meeting and have a conversation and make decisions that are right for me. That's it. Marcus absorbed this. He seemed uncertain whether it was generosity or something else. That's more than I deserve, Marcus said. Probably, Ethan said. I'm not doing it for you. He got in the elevator. The executive conference room on the 6th floor was a different environment than everything below it. Intentionally so, the kind of design that signals through its materials and proportions that certain conversations happen here and other conversations happen elsewhere. Long table, real wood, the kind of chairs that were comfortable in a considered way rather than a cheap way. Windows looking out over the business corridor, and beyond it, the larger shape of the city in the morning heat. Victoria Hale was already there when he arrived. She was at the far end of the table, not the head. A choice, he thought, deliberate. There was a tablet in front of her with something on the screen he couldn't read from the door, and a legal pad with handwritten notes, and 2 cups of coffee, one of which she gestured toward when he came in. He sat. He took the coffee. She looked at him for a moment with the same recalibrating attention she'd had when he first walked into her conference room the night before, the look of someone reconciling a new picture with an old one. I spent this morning reading your personnel file, she said. He waited. and the original engineering evaluation from 2021. Both versions. She turned the tablet toward him. On the screen was a document he recognized, the evaluation he'd never seen but had always suspected existed. The original assessment rated you as essential infrastructure personnel, irreplaceable without significant operational risk. That language was removed before it reached me and replaced with language recommending elimination of the role. He looked at the document. I also read your original system documentation from 2009 and the 2013 addendum where Thermalink was first described. She paused. The 2013 addendum is 60 pages. You wrote it in 8 days. It was a complex system. The current team's audit report is 40 pages and took 3 weeks. She said it without emphasis, just precision. I'm not criticizing their work. I'm establishing context. He nodded. I was misled, she said. I want to say that clearly before anything else. Not as an excuse. See, I'm the CEO. My decisions are my decisions regardless of what information I was given, and I own the outcome of those decisions. But I was given a picture of this company's infrastructure and the people responsible for it that was specifically constructed to serve one person's agenda, and I made significant structural decisions based on that picture. Marcus told me last night that the evaluation was changed. He told you. In the elevator, on his way out. Something moved across Victoria's face. That's... She stopped. Okay. She picked up her pen and set it down again. I want to ask you something directly. Oh, go ahead. When you came in last night, when you walked into that lab at 7 in the evening with a toolbox and 11 pages of handwritten notes, why did you come? He thought about it. Not about the answer, which he knew, but about how to say it accurately. Because the system was failing and I was the only person who could fix it. That's not the whole answer. He looked at her. You could have let it fail, she said. From where you were standing, there was an argument for letting it fail. The company that fired you, the executive who manipulated your evaluation, the team that removed a system you built without consulting you. There was a version of last night where you don't answer Robert's call. Yes. But you came. I came because 14 companies were losing service they depend on, and the people responsible for that aren't the clients. He paused. And because Chenwei and Priya and David are good engineers who were set up to fail by information they didn't have, and that's not their fault. And because... He stopped. Because... He thought about Lily asking him what was wrong at the ice cream shop, her face doing the impression of his thinking expression. He thought about the kitchen table, the notebook, the 11 pages in the manila envelope. He thought about the specific feeling of sitting at that workstation and doing the thing he was built to do, after years of doing something adjacent to it, and the way that had felt, not triumphant, nothing that clean, but right, in the fundamental way that things are right when they are what they are. Because it was my system, he said. I built it. I don't stop caring about whether it works just because someone took my name off it. Victoria looked at him for a long time. Outside, through the windows, the city sat in its summer heat, and the business corridor below was filling with the ordinary morning of people going to work, and the sky was white and hard above it. Another day already climbing toward another record. And Ethan Mercer sat in an executive conference room for the first time in 3 years in the same building where he'd spent 6 years being invisible and waited to hear what the woman across the table had decided to do about all of it. She picked up her pen. I want to talk to you about what comes next, she said. And the conversation began. The conversation lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. Ethan knew this because the analog clock on the conference room wall, same style as the one in the infrastructure lab, the building apparently had a preference, was visible over Victoria's left shoulder, and he found himself checking it not out of impatience, but out of the same habit that made him track thermal readings and system uptime. Elapsed time was data. Data was orientation. Victoria talked first for about 20 minutes, and what she said was a structured account of what she had learned and when she had learned it, delivered in the precise sequential way of someone who has spent the early morning organizing a complex picture into a form she can speak clearly. She had received the documents at 9:47 the previous evening, during the repair, during the window when Ethan had watched her step away for the phone call that changed the texture of the room. The documents had come through her personal email, not her company account. The sender address was one she didn't recognize, and which she'd already confirmed with her IT director that morning had been created and used once. She did not speculate about who had sent them. She moved past that question with a deliberateness that told Ethan she had theories she wasn't ready to share, or possibly theories she was protecting for reasons he didn't yet understand. The documents themselves were three things: a copy of the original 2021 engineering evaluation with a metadata trail showing 2 revision sessions. The second conducted from Marcus Drell's company account, an email chain from early 2021 between Marcus and the company's previous HR director that used language about Ethan's role that ranged from dismissive to, in one message, something closer to deliberately misrepresenting. And a third document that Ethan didn't immediately understand until Victoria explained it. An internal competitive analysis Marcus had commissioned in 2020 comparing Vertex's infrastructure costs against 2 competitors, which had been used as the basis for the restructuring recommendation and which had, according to the annotation someone had added to the copy Victoria received, excluded several relevant cost categories in ways that made the restructuring look more economically justified than it was. "Someone did significant work to assemble this package," Victoria said. "It's not a dump of random files, it's a curated argument." "I see that. Do you have any idea who sent it?" He thought about Robert Aguirre, who had been the one to call him, who had been in the building for 30 years and had a particular understanding of its internal geography. He thought about Priya's apology, delivered at 4 in the morning through David. He thought about Chen Wei, who had been an honest interlocutor in a difficult situation, but who had also, at some point during the last 2 years, understood more about the circumstances of Ethan's departure than he'd initially let on. "No," Ethan said. It was technically true. He didn't know. He had a strong intuition about Robert, based on nothing more specific than the timing and the 3-decade loyalty of a man who took institutional fairness personally. But intuition wasn't knowledge, and he wasn't going to offer it. Victoria looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who has decided not to press a point. "All right," she said. She picked up her pen and moved to the second part of what she'd prepared. "I want to talk about the company's situation and your place in it," she said. "And I want to do this in a way that's honest about what I know and what I don't, rather than presenting you with something that sounds cleaner than it is. I appreciate that. What I know, you designed and built Core. You trained the 3 engineers who currently maintain it. You identified the specific failure risk created by the Thermalink deprecation months before last night's event, documented it, attempted to report it through appropriate channels, and were ignored. Last night you came in on 4 hours' notice and repaired a system failure that, without your intervention, would have resulted in contractual penalties that our financial team estimates at between $4 and $6 million, with secondary reputational damage that is harder to calculate but real." She said all of this without inflection, without performance, just as a list of facts that she was laying on the table between them. "What I don't know," she continued, "is the full scope of what Marcus did, what the board knew or didn't know about the circumstances of your departure, and whether there are other decisions made during that period that I need to revisit. That investigation is going to take time. I'm not going to pretend it's resolved because we had a crisis that you solved. I understand. What I also don't know..." She paused here, which was the first pause in her prepared structure, the first place where the language became something she was finding as she went rather than delivering. "What I don't know is what you want. I have thoughts about what I think is right, what I think the company owes you, what I think you could do here. But I'm aware that I've been the CEO of this company while you spent 3 years in a maintenance uniform, and that means my perspective on what's right and yours may not be the same." Ethan looked at her. Outside the windows, the city shimmered in the heat. "Ask me," he said. "What do you want?" He'd been thinking about it since the elevator. Since the drive home at 1 in the morning, through empty streets, with his toolbox in the trunk and his back hurting, and the particular quiet of a city that has temporarily stopped demanding things of you. He'd turned the question over while he lay in bed for 4 hours, not quite sleeping, while he listened to Lily in the kitchen, while he drove her to camp and watched her run inside. "I want an honest accounting," he said. "Not for me specifically. I want the company to have an accurate understanding of what happened and why it happened, because the same conditions that produced the Thermalink situation can produce other situations, and those future situations don't care about my specific grievances. That's a principled answer, Victoria said. What else? I want the work I did to be on record, not as a political statement, just the record should be accurate. I built core. I trained your infrastructure team. That should be documented correctly. Agreed. What else? He hesitated. This was the part he'd been working around, the part that had the most vulnerability in it, the part where being honest about what he wanted required acknowledging that there was something he wanted. I want to keep working on the system, he said. Not to reclaim something. Not because I need the title or the office, but because it's not finished. The secondary tripwire Priya identified is one example. There are at least 3 other refinements I've been thinking about for 2 years that would make the architecture more resilient. I want to do that work. Victoria nodded slowly. And the maintenance role. I'd like to not wear that badge anymore, so he said. But that's a preference, not a condition. Something at the edge of her mouth moved, controlled but genuine. Noted. She turned the legal pad over. He could see that the side she'd been writing on was full, dense with handwriting in the small, precise script of someone trained in an era before everything went to keyboards. I have a proposal. You don't have to answer today. Okay. I want to create a position that doesn't currently exist at Vertex. Chief Infrastructure Architect. The title matters less than the scope. Full authority over core and all related systems. Independent reporting structure directly to me. Staff of your choosing within budget parameters. No operational responsibilities that take you away from the technical work. She paused. Compensation at the senior executive band. Backdated severance for the 3-year period in the maintenance role. Structured as a settlement rather than wages to simplify the accounting. He was quiet. I know the money doesn't fix what happened, she said. I'm not offering it as a fix. I'm offering it as an attempt at accuracy, to make the financial record reflect something closer to the actual value of the last 3 years. What happens to Marcus? She looked at him directly. That's an active process. I'm not going to discuss the specifics with you because you have a direct conflict of interest that makes it inappropriate, and also because it's not complete. What I can tell you is that the altered evaluation and the email chain are being reviewed by external counsel, and I'm not the only person with standing to respond to what they contain. The board? The board will be informed, yes. He thought about this, thought about what it meant to want Marcus to face consequences versus what it meant to spend energy on that wanting. Thought about what he'd said in the hallway. I'm not going to build a case or advocate for consequences. And whether he meant it, and found that he did, mostly. He cared more about the company having accurate information than he cared about Marcus's specific fate. Those 2 things might produce the same outcome. They might not. Either way, one was his business and one wasn't. I don't want to be involved in that process, he said. I'm not asking you to be. He looked at the legal pad, at the tablet with the altered evaluation, at Victoria Hale, who had come into this company's story after the important chapters had already been written and was now trying to write honest corrections into a narrative that had been deliberately distorted. I'll think about the offer, he said. I said I would, and I meant it. Take the time you need. I'd like an answer within the week, but that's a preference, not a deadline. She paused. Is there anything else you need from me today? Just one thing. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the manila envelope, now somewhat worn from its night of travel. He set it on the table. The Thermalink documentation, the full version, including the adjustments made during last night's rebuild. The technical record should be in the company's files, not in my kitchen drawer. Victoria looked at the envelope. She picked it up with both hands, which was a small gesture but a careful one. Thank you, she said. He stood. His back reminded him of its objection, less insistent than the night before but still present. I'll be in touch. He walked out of the executive conference room and down the hallway toward the elevator, and at no point did he pass anyone who treated him like a fire extinguisher. He ate lunch alone at a diner 2 miles from the campus, a place he'd been going since his engineering years, when the founder had been alive and the coffee had been better. The founder's daughter ran it now, and the coffee was adequate and the eggs were still made correctly, which was a sufficient level of continuity. He ordered the same thing he always ordered, eggs over easy, wheat toast, coffee, and sat in the booth by the window and watched the street outside in the lunch hour heat, The offer sat with him the way significant things sit, not pressing, not demanding immediate resolution, but present, giving everything else in his thinking a slight gravitational weight. Chief Infrastructure Architect, full authority, direct to Victoria. 3 years ago, he would have taken it immediately, would have been grateful for it in the specific way of someone who has been told they are not wanted and is then offered wanting, and that gratitude would have been real, but would also have had a slightly desperate undertone, the relief of reinstatement, of legitimacy restored by external authority. He didn't feel that now, and the absence of it was interesting enough to sit with. He finished his eggs, left a tip that was probably excessive, drove to the community center to pick up Lily 2 hours early because she'd asked him to be there for the afternoon session's showcase project, and he'd told her he would try. And after a night like last night and a morning like this morning, trying was going to mean showing up. The showcase was 12 kids standing in front of foam board displays, explaining coding projects they'd built over the previous 2 weeks. Lily's project was a program that calculated how long it would take to read any book, based on the book's word count and the reader's average words per minute, which she had measured for herself by timing 3 chapters of Wings of Fire and taking an average. She explained it to him with the focused intensity of someone presenting to a serious audience, which, from her perspective, he was. The formula is words divided by speed equals minutes, she said. Then you divide by 60 to get hours, and then if you want, you can add in breaks. Do you add in breaks? Only for really long books. Normal books don't need them. He looked at the display, the handwritten formula at the top, the example calculations below it, her careful printed letters in blue marker. This is good, Lily. I know, she said, with the uncomplicated certainty of a child who had done something well and saw no reason to diminish it. He laughed, which was the second time she'd made him laugh in 2 days, and the frequency of it registered somewhere as significant. They drove home in the afternoon heat with the car windows down because the air conditioning had been running weak since May and he hadn't fixed it, which was a certain irony given his professional history. Lily talked about the other kids' projects. One had built a temperature converter, one had made a quiz game, one had tried to make something involving music and it hadn't quite worked, but she said the idea was good. He listened and asked questions, and the city went past the windows in its summer afternoon intensity, and somewhere in the middle of it he felt something that was hard to name precisely, a quality of being exactly where he was supposed to be, not in the grand determined sense, but in the simpler sense of a person who has finished a significant piece of work and come home. They had dinner. He made the pasta again because it was fast, and Lily had declared it adequate, which was the standard he was working to. She helped set the table, which she was going through a phase of taking seriously, aligning the fork on the exact correct side with the concentration of someone performing a task that matters. "Dad," she said from across the table. "Yeah." "Are you going back to the regular job tomorrow?" He looked at her. "I don't know yet." She considered this. The maintenance one or the fixing things one. Those might be the same job depending on how you look at it. She gave him the evaluating look. "That's a weird answer." "It's an honest one." She accepted this and went back to her pasta, and the evening settled around them, and the heat outside continued its slow retreat as the day pulled the sun down and the sky went through its gradations. He called Robert at 7:30 after Lily was in the bath. Robert picked up on the second ring. "How'd it go?" "She offered me Chief Infrastructure Architect, Senior Executive Band, direct to her, full authority over core." Robert was quiet for a moment. It's significant, I know. Are you going to take it?" "I'm thinking." "What's to think about?" Ethan sat at the kitchen table with his notebook in front of him, open to a blank page. He'd been drawing core architecture diagrams for the last hour, without being aware he was doing it. The kind of thinking through the hand that he'd been doing since graduate school. "I'm thinking about whether I want to go back into that building as an employee. What it means to have my value defined by a title and a compensation band after 3 years of having it defined by something else." "Something else," Robert repeated. "The work. Just the work, without the rest of it." Robert was quiet for a moment. "The work doesn't change just because you have a better badge." "I know, but the relationship to it does." "Maybe that's not bad." He looked at the diagram on the notebook page. It was core. The architecture he'd been carrying in his head for 15 years, rendered in his small, cramped handwriting on a kitchen table after dinner, the way it had always been, in the margins, in the gaps, in the hours after Lily was asleep. Maybe, he said. Ethan. Robert's voice had something in it. Can I say something you might not want to hear? Go ahead. You've been running this system from a maintenance stool for 3 years. You flagged the problem. You rebuilt the protocol. You kept 14 companies in service last night. And you did all of that without anyone calling you chief anything. He paused. You don't need the title to know what you are. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't have it. He sat with that. The title's not for you, Robert continued. The title's for the building. It's so the next time you need root-level access at midnight to fix something, you don't have to wait 11 minutes for a CEO to authorize your credentials. Ethan exhaled slowly. That's a practical argument. I'm a practical person. He looked at the notebook, at the diagram, at the blank space on the page where the secondary tripwire would go, the one Priya had identified, the one that didn't exist yet but needed to. How's the plant in your office? He said. Still dying. I'll bring it something tomorrow. Robert made a sound that was approximately an exhale of relief. Yeah, okay. He went to see Priya the following morning. She was in the infrastructure lab, which was running in its normal daytime mode now. The crisis atmosphere fully dissipated, the screens showing nominal readings, the room having returned to the quiet, productive hum of a team doing maintenance work. David had gone home to sleep sometime the previous afternoon and was back, slightly more functional, at his station. Chen Wei was in the adjoining glass-walled office on a call. Priya looked up when he came in. She held his gaze for a second without speaking, and he understood the apology she'd sent through David in a clearer way than he had then. It was in her face now, too, not heavy, not performed, just present. The acknowledgement of someone who had been honest with themselves about a complicated thing. The tripwire specs, he said. Can I see what you wrote up? She pulled up the document. He read it, standing, which his back was now registering as suboptimal, but which felt right for the interaction. It was a clean piece of engineering, simple, elegant, exactly the kind of addition that improves a system without complicating it. This is good, he said. You would have gotten there. Maybe, but you got there first, and that's what matters. He handed the tablet back. I want to talk about implementation timing, if you're running the team's schedule. I am, nominally. Chen has final say. Then let's get Chen in here. What followed was 40 minutes of the specific kind of conversation that Ethan had been conducting his whole career and had, during his maintenance years, conducted only in his own head at the kitchen table. Technical, direct, built on the assumption that everyone in the room was capable and should be treated accordingly. They worked through the implementation plan for the Tripwire edition, identified 2 other system refinements that the previous night's event had surfaced as worth addressing, and scheduled a full core architecture review for the following week. At no point did anyone discuss what his role was or what badge he was wearing. The work organized itself around the knowledge in the room, the way systems organize themselves around reliable processes. At the end of it, Chen Wei leaned back in his chair and looked at Ethan with the expression of someone who has recalibrated significantly in the last 48 hours and is living in the recalibration. You should be in this room, Chen said, not as a visitor. I'm working on it, Ethan said. He called Victoria's assistant at 2 that afternoon and asked for 15 minutes of her time. He got it at 3:45, a gap between back-to-back meetings that her assistant indicated was genuinely tight, which suited him because what he had to say didn't require long. She was standing when he came in, jacket off, in the middle of what looked like a transition from one set of documents to another. She looked at him with the focused attention she apparently gave everyone who came through her door, which was the kind of attention that made people feel taken seriously. I'm accepting the offer, he said. She nodded. No visible surprise. With one modification. She waited. The title is fine. The authority structure is fine. The compensation? I'd like the backdated settlement structured as a direct acknowledgement of the altered evaluation rather than characterized as unpaid wages. The distinction matters for the record. Victoria picked up her pen. That's a reasonable request. I'll have legal structure it that way. And I want to continue working with Chen's team, not above them. The reporting structure you described gives me authority over the systems, but I want the day-to-day relationship to be collaborative. Chenwei is a good engineer and Priya Naya is better than her current title reflects. If I'm coming in at a senior level, I'd like their titles to reflect the work they've actually been doing. Victoria looked at him. You're negotiating on behalf of the people hired to replace you. I'm asking for the record to be accurate, he said. That's been my consistent position. She made a note. I'll have HR review their classifications. She looked up. Anything else? He thought about it. No. Then we have an agreement. She set the pen down. I want to say something that isn't part of the official conversation. He waited. When I took this position, I was told Vertex had a strong infrastructure foundation managed by a capable team. She said it carefully, choosing each word. What I've understood in the last 2 days is that the foundation was strong because one person built it correctly, and the team was capable because that same person trained them, and neither of those facts were communicated to me. I've been running a company whose core asset was invisible to me. She paused. I don't fully understand yet what else I don't know about this organization. That investigation is ongoing, but I want you to know that the way I make decisions going forward is going to be different, and that's a direct result of the last 48 hours. He looked at her. I appreciate you saying that. It's not absolution. I know, but it's accurate. Yes, he said, it is. He left her office and took the elevator down. In the lobby, he stopped at the security desk where Tanya was working her afternoon shift, and he took his maintenance badge out of his jacket pocket and set it on the counter. She looked at it, looked at him. I think I need a different one, he said. Tanya picked up the maintenance badge. Her expression was the particular expression of someone who understands that a significant thing has just occurred and is not going to make a performance of it. She turned to her computer. I'll need to put in a request to HR for a new credential, she said. They'll have to reclassify your profile. That's fine. I'll wait. It might take a few days. That's okay too. She looked at him. What should the new one say? He thought about it, about the question and the specific answer, about what it meant to have a badge that said what you were, and whether that mattered, and in what way it mattered, and why it had taken this long. Chief Infrastructure Architect, he said. She typed it, saved the request, looked up at him with the straight-faced composure of someone who had watched a lot of things happen in this lobby and treated all of them with the same professional neutrality. I'll let you know when it's ready, she said. He nodded. He walked toward the main entrance, and through the glass doors the afternoon was still hot. Still unreasonably, stubbornly hot, the kind of heat that doesn't apologize and doesn't explain itself, just sits on everything with its full weight. But the forecast for the following week showed a break coming, a front moving through, the temperatures dropping back to something the systems were built to handle. He pushed through the door and walked to his car. His phone buzzed as he reached it. A text from Lily's camp counselor that said there'd been an afternoon snack mix-up, and could he bring something for the ride home. He texted back that he'd stop at the bakery on the way. He got in the car, started the engine. The broken passenger side mirror caught the afternoon sun at an angle that made it more visible than usual, a bright flash that he had to squint against for a moment. He'd been meaning to fix that for 2 years. He added it to the list. The new badge took 4 days. He knew this because he counted them. Not obsessively, not with the particular hunger of someone waiting for validation, but with the steady awareness of a person who has made a decision and is watching the machinery of institutions catch up to it. 4 days during which he came to work in the same 2009 Accord, parked in the same spot in Lot C, and walked into the building through the main entrance carrying nothing except his notebook and a coffee he'd made at home in a thermos because the fourth-floor coffee had never been as good as people pretended. He used a temporary credential those 4 days, a paper badge and a plastic sleeve that Tanya had printed with the professionalism of someone who understood that the interim version still needed to be treated as real. It said his name and senior technical consultant, pending reclassification, which was HR's way of handling the gap between what was and what was being processed, and which he wore without complaint because he had spent 3 years wearing a badge that said, Maintenance, Level 2, and a piece of laminated paper wasn't going to trouble him. What those 4 days actually were, practically, was a series of conversations he hadn't expected to need and found he needed badly. The first was with David Okafor, who stopped him in the hallway on the second morning and asked if they could talk. They went to the break room on the third floor, which was slightly less trafficked than the fourth floor coffee station, and which had a corner table that had been host to more private conversations than the building's architects had probably intended. David was direct in the way he'd been direct during the repair work. No circling, no preliminary softening. "I need to tell you something about the audit," he said. "Okay." "When I flagged Thermalink as legacy overhead. I want to be accurate about this. It wasn't just that the documentation was incomplete. I did find a reference to it in an older commit log. The comment in the log said, Thermal Cascade Prevention, E. Mercer, 2013. It had your name on it." Ethan looked at him. "I should have looked it up," David said. "I should have found you and asked what it was. You were in the building. I knew you were in the building. I didn't because—" He stopped. Started again. Honestly. Because Marcus had been pretty clear, in ways that were never explicit enough to quote, that your input on the system wasn't to be solicited. He never said, "Don't ask Ethan." He said things like, "The transition needs clean separation, and we need the new team to own this fully, and I heard what I was supposed to hear." Ethan was quiet. "I'm not putting that entirely on Marcus," David said. "I made the choice, and I want you to know that I know I made it, because I think that matters for whatever this is going forward." "What do you think it matters for?" Ethan said. David looked at the table. "I want to work well with you, and I can't do that if there's a thing I haven't said that both of us know I should have said." He looked at David Okafor, 29 years old, second-generation Nigerian-American, with a graduate degree from Georgia Tech and the specific moral seriousness of someone who had been raised to take accountability as a value rather than a performance. He thought about what it cost to have that conversation, to walk up to a man who had been wronged by a situation you participated in and say the uncomfortable true thing without dressing it as smaller than it was. "Thank you," Ethan said. "Genuinely. I know you don't need it. I'm saying it anyway." He paused. "The audit decision cost something real. I'm not going to tell you otherwise. But you were given incomplete information and a working environment that discouraged correction, and you're 29, and the fact that you're sitting here saying what you just said tells me more about who you are than the audit decision does." David looked at him steadily. "Is that true, or are you being generous?" "Both," Ethan said. "They're not mutually exclusive." The second conversation he hadn't expected was with someone outside the infrastructure team entirely. Her name was Sandra Osei, and she was Vertex's Director of Client Relations, the person responsible for managing the 14 enterprise accounts whose service had been interrupted during the crisis. She found him on the third day in the sub-level 2 maintenance corridor, which told him she'd either asked around for where he spent time or had been paying more attention to building geography than her title suggested. She was 53, broad-shouldered, with the particular authority of someone who had spent 20 years being the person clients called when they were angry, and she had a directness that he appreciated immediately. "You're the one who fixed the outage," she said, not a question. "The team fixed it. I contributed. 3 of my 14 accounts called me personally the morning after the outage, not to complain, to ask what happened and whether it would happen again." She looked at him. When clients call the morning after an outage, they're usually deciding whether to start looking at alternatives. 2 of those 3 told me that their systems had come back online faster than they'd expected and asked me to pass along their appreciation. "That's the team," he said again. "I know who was in the room," Sandra said. "I talked to David." He paused. "I'm not here to give you credit. I'm here to tell you that the way this crisis was managed, the fact that we made the penalty threshold, the fact that 3 major clients walked away feeling handled rather than abandoned, has real consequences for this company's retention numbers. And I wanted the person responsible to know that." He looked at her. "Why?" She raised an eyebrow. "Because the people who do the work that makes other people's jobs possible should know when that work mattered." She said it like it was obvious. That's just basic decency. He thought about the last 3 years, about calibrating cooling units in an empty basement corridor at 6:40 in the morning, and about the 14 client accounts whose data had moved through systems he'd built without anyone on either end of the transaction knowing he existed. "Thank you," he said. "That means something." "Good," Sandra said. She turned to leave, then turned back. For what it's worth, I've been here 11 years. I remember when you were in the engineering division. I always thought what happened to you was wrong, and I was not brave enough to say so at the time, and I'm saying so now." She shrugged, which was a gesture that contained more honesty than most speeches. "Late is what I had." She walked away, and he stood in the basement corridor and listened to the sound of the cooling systems and thought about the word late and the specific weight it carries. Not the weight of too late, which forecloses, but the weight of late enough, which doesn't. So, on the fourth day, the badge was ready. Tanya handed it across the security desk with the same professional equanimity with which she'd accepted the maintenance badge 4 days earlier, and he put it in his pocket without looking at it, and he thanked her, and he took the elevator to the 5th floor. He put the badge on in the elevator, looking at his reflection in the stainless steel door while the floors ticked up. Ethan Mercer, Chief Infrastructure Architect. His reflection looked back at him with the particular distortion of polished metal, slightly wider than reality, slightly softer at the edges. He looked like himself. That was the thing. He looked exactly like himself. The week that followed was dense with the specific kind of work that Ethan had always found most satisfying. Not the crisis work, not the everything is on fire work, but the steady incremental work of building something correctly from a position of understanding. He ran the full core architecture review he'd scheduled with Chen Wei and Priya and David, which took 3 days of focused sessions, and produced a document that was 22 pages longer than any architecture review Vertex had previously conducted, and which covered not just the current state of the system, but the reasoning behind every major structural decision going back to 2009. He wrote the reasoning himself, in the evenings, at the kitchen table. Lily asked him once why he was always writing by hand when he had a laptop right there, and he told her it was because the hand remembered things the keyboard didn't, which she considered seriously before deciding was probably a grown-up thing she'd understand later. He told her he thought that was probably right. The secondary tripwire went into production on a Thursday, implemented by Priya with Chen Wei and David in support, and it ran clean from the first deployment. No errors, no unexpected interactions, the system absorbing it the way a well-designed system absorbs a well-designed addition. Ethan was in the room when it went live, not at a workstation but standing back, watching the monitoring screens, and he felt something watching Priya run that implementation that was different from how he'd felt running the Thermalink rebuild 8 days earlier. That had been survival. This was something else. This was the system growing in the hands of people who understood it, and understanding had come from the honest reckoning of a terrible night, and the night had come from a long chain of choices. Some bad, some cowardly, some made from grief and exhaustion, and the quiet erosion of a person who had stopped fighting for himself. And at the end of the chain was this, the system running better than it had before, in a room full of people who now knew what they had. He didn't know exactly what to call the feeling. It wasn't triumph. It was more like the feeling of a debt paid. Not a debt owed to him, but a debt to the work itself, to the idea that if you build something well, it deserves to be understood well, and that understanding is a form of respect that outlasts any title or any slight. Marcus Drell left Vertex Dynamics 12 days after the outage. The announcement came through internal communications in the carefully neutral language that corporations use for departures that are not voluntary. Has decided to pursue other opportunities. We thank him for his contributions. We wish him well. Ethan read it at his workstation and then closed the email and went back to the documentation he was writing. He'd expected to feel more, and he felt what he felt, which was not much. There was no satisfaction in it, no vindication. There was something like the resolution of a held chord, a tension that had been present so long it had become background, releasing into a silence that was simply silence. He didn't linger on it. He had work to do. What he did think about in the days that followed was the specific question of what Marcus had been. Not in the moral categorizing sense. He wasn't interested in that, had never been particularly interested in that, but in the practical human sense of what conditions produce a Marcus Drell, and what responsibility a system bears for those conditions. Marcus had been good at the political geometry of organizational life, and he'd lived in organizations that rewarded that geometry. And at some point, the rewards had become so reliable that he'd stopped distinguishing between what he was good at and what was good. That was a failure of the man. It was also a failure of every structure that had reinforced the behavior for long enough that he'd forgotten it was a choice. Ethan had spent 3 years being the evidence of that failure without having the standing to name it. He had that standing now. He intended to use it carefully. He talked to Victoria about it in a meeting 2 weeks after his new title became official. Not about Marcus specifically, but about the organizational conditions that had allowed the altered evaluation and the suppressed warning to persist uncorrected for as long as they had. The structure rewarded confidence over accuracy, he said. People were incentivized to have strong positions and to defend them rather than to be uncertain and investigate. The engineers who deprecate Thermalink were trying to demonstrate decisive modernization. The executive who altered my evaluation was trying to demonstrate bold leadership. In both cases, the system gave them better outcomes for the performance than it would have given them for admitting they didn't know something. Victoria was listening with her pen in her hand but not writing. What would you change? I'd make it structurally safer to say I don't know. I'd make it structurally easier for people at every level to flag concerns without needing to have the perfect documentation and the perfect channel and the perfectly timed moment. Robert Aguirre passed my 5 pages up the chain and was told the team had reviewed it, and he had no recourse and no escalation path, and he accepted that because the culture made accepting easier than pushing. He paused. That's not a Robert Aguirre problem. That's an architecture problem. And architecture problems are things I can help with. Victoria looked at him. Write that up. It'll take more than a memo. Write it up anyway. Starting point. He wrote it up. 14 pages, delivered on a Friday afternoon. Victoria forwarded it to the board with a cover note he wasn't shown, but which Robert told him, through the reliable informal channel of a man who knew everyone in the building, had been characterized as essential reading. He didn't find out if the board agreed. He let it go into the process and moved on. That was what you did with things you'd said correctly. You said them, and you released them, because the saying was what was yours, and the rest was other people's choices. 6 weeks after the outage, on a Saturday morning in late August, when the heat had finally broken, and the city was moving through the particular relief of a first cool morning after a long hot summer, Ethan Mercer stood in his kitchen at 7:15 and made pancakes. He'd promised Lily pancakes the night of the crisis, before he drove to the building with his toolbox and 11 pages, and the knowledge that nobody else was going to fix what he had built. He'd promised them when she was asleep and hadn't heard him, which meant the promise had been made to himself, which was the kind of promise that mattered more rather than less. He made them from scratch, not from a mix, from the recipe Mara had learned from her grandmother and written on an index card in her slanted handwriting that he still had, tucked in the kitchen drawer beside the spot where the manila envelope had lived. Flour, baking powder, an egg, milk, a little sugar, a little salt, butter in the pan. The recipe was not complicated. It was exact. Lily came out in her pajamas at 7:30, her hair the particular catastrophe it always was in the morning, and stopped at the kitchen door and looked at the pan on the stove. Pancakes, she said. Yeah. Real ones? What other kind is there? She climbed onto her chair at the kitchen table and watched him with the focused appreciation of a child who has learned that some mornings are just mornings and some mornings are something more. Is today a special day? He thought about how to answer that, the specific, honest answer. I made a promise a few weeks ago that I'm keeping today. Who did you promise? Myself, kind of. She considered this. That counts, she said, with the judicial certainty of a 7-year-old who has thought about this issue. I think so, too. He made the pancakes. He made them in 3 batches because the pan only held 2 at a time, and he was not going to rush the pan because rushing the pan was how you got uneven browning, and Mara's grandmother's recipe did not intend uneven browning. Lily ate 4 of them with maple syrup and approximately the correct amount of butter, which was a standard he'd established early and she'd absorbed without complaint, and she ate them with the quiet happiness of a child who is having exactly what she wanted and knows it. He ate 2 and drank his coffee and sat across from her at the kitchen table in the morning light and let himself be in the moment, which was a thing he was not always good at but was trying to be better at, because Lily was 7 and she was going to be 8, and then she was going to be 12, and then she was going to be 17. And the speed of that progression was something he felt some mornings in his chest like a specific weight. Not grief exactly, but adjacent to it. The awareness that time only goes one direction and presence is the only response that makes any sense. Dad, she said. Yeah. What's the thing you built? At work? He looked at her. What do you mean? You said you built the thing that broke and you fixed it. What is it actually? He thought about how to explain core to a 7-year-old, which was, he realized, not as different from explaining it to a board of directors as people might assume. Both audiences needed the essential shape without the technical load. Both needed to understand what it was for, not how it worked. It's like, he thought, you know how the library has a system for finding books? Where every book is in a specific place, and there are rules about how the places are organized, so you can find anything even though there are thousands of books? The Dewey Decimal System, she said. We learned about that. Right. Core is like that, but for information that a company needs to keep running. Data, communications, records, all of it. It has rules for where everything lives and how it gets from one place to another, and those rules have to work even when a lot of things are happening at once. She was quiet, processing. And you made up all the rules. I made up the first version of the rules. Other people have added to them. But it was your idea. The structure was my idea. She looked at him with the evaluating expression he'd come to understand as her processing look. The face she made when she was deciding whether something was what it said it was or something different. So it's like a language, she said. You made a language and taught it to other people and now they use it. He looked at her. He stopped. Yeah, that's actually a better way to say it than most of what I've said. She seemed pleased but not surprised, which was one of the things he loved about her. Are you going to keep working on it? For a long time, probably. Good, she said. Languages should have the person who made them looking after them. He picked up his coffee cup, which was almost empty. Outside the kitchen window, the morning was bright and genuinely cool, the sky a clean September blue after weeks of white heat haze, and the neighborhood was quiet with the specific quality of a Saturday that hasn't decided what it's going to be yet. A dog barked somewhere down the block. A car passed with its windows down. He thought about Mara, the way he allowed himself to think about her on certain mornings, not with the grief that had been so large in the early years that it had structural properties. More like acknowledging a presence that had shaped everything and was still shaping it. She had been a middle school science teacher, and she had been, in her specific way, the one who taught him to explain things to people who weren't already inside the same technical world. Say what it's for before you say how it works, she used to tell him, which was advice he'd probably internalized so deeply he'd stopped knowing it came from her. She would have gotten along well with Lily, which was both a comfort and a thing he tried not to spend too much time in because the spending led somewhere he couldn't always find his way back from. He set down the coffee cup. He looked at his daughter, who was conducting a careful operation with her last quarter of pancake, cutting it into exact thirds with the seriousness of a person for whom precision mattered. What do you want to do today? He said. The park, she said, without looking up from the pancake operation. And then I want to go to the bookstore because I finished Wings of Fire number 3. Which one do you want next? Number 4. She looked up as if this were obvious. You read them in order. Right. Dad. Yeah. You should read them too, so we can talk about them. He looked at her, 7 years old, gap-toothed, conducting surgery on her pancake, entirely serious. He thought about the past year, about the notebook and the toolbox and the maintenance badge and the 5 pages he'd handed to Robert and the 11 pages he'd written in the kitchen and the 4 hours in the infrastructure lab and the meeting in the executive conference room and the new badge in his pocket. He thought about all the years of being in a building that had decided not to see him and the specific choices he'd made in response to being unseen, some of which had been right and some of which had not been, and the fact that both categories had led here. To this kitchen, this table, this morning. Okay, he said. Okay, you'll read them? Okay, I'll read them. She went back to the pancakes, satisfied. He stood and took their plates to the sink. And outside the window, the morning was doing what September mornings do in this part of the country when the summer finally concedes. It was being genuinely, unambiguously good, the air having that particular quality that makes people step outside and stop for a second and look up. The quality that is so simple it takes a person by surprise every year, as if they'd forgotten it was possible. He washed the dishes. He dried them. He put them back where they belonged. On Monday morning, he drove to Vertex Dynamics, parked in Lot C, walked into the main lobby, and nodded to Tanya, who nodded back. He took the elevator to the 5th floor. He had a meeting at 9 with Chenwei and Priya about the next phase of the architecture review, and at 11 he had a call with Victoria about the organizational culture proposal, and in the afternoon there was a new junior engineer starting, a 23-year-old named James Whitfield, who had been hired specifically to support the infrastructure team's expansion and who had, according to his hire documentation, graduated at the top of his program and had strong references and absolutely no experience with anything like core. Which meant that sometime this week, Ethan was going to sit down with James Whitfield and begin explaining a system from the ground up, explaining not just what it did and how it worked, but why every decision had been made, what problem each layer solved, where the thinking had come from, and where it was still incomplete. He was going to document the reasoning this time, all of it. He was going to make sure that the knowledge existed somewhere other than his own head, not because he planned to disappear from the building again, but because a system that only one person understands is not finished yet. That was the last thing he'd understood. The thing that had come to him not in a sudden way but slowly, over the weeks since the outage, accumulating with the rest of it into something that felt true, in the specific way that things feel true when they've earned their clarity. He had built something worth building. He had been moved away from it, and the moving had not destroyed it, because what he'd built was solid enough to hold for years with imperfect maintenance and partial understanding. He had come back to it when it needed him most. And now the work wasn't to reclaim it, or protect it, or prove through it that he was what he was. The work was to make sure that what he knew could outlive his knowing it. That the next person who sat in that room at midnight with a failing system and a clock running toward catastrophe would have more than 11 handwritten pages in a kitchen drawer to work from. That was the job. The real one. Underneath all the other ones. He got off the elevator on the 5th floor. Through the glass wall of the infrastructure lab, he could see Chenwei at his workstation, and Priya pulling up something on her screen, and David on his monitoring station running what looked like a routine diagnostic, all three of them doing the ordinary work of a morning that had no crisis in it, no panic, no cascade failure spreading through a cluster of compromised nodes in a record-breaking heat. Just people, in a room, tending something that was working. He pushed open the door. "Morning," Chenwei said, without looking up. "Morning," Priya said. David raised his coffee cup. Ethan set his notebook on the corner of the workstation table and sat down, and the morning continued, and the system ran. And outside the windows, the September sky was the kind of blue that doesn't need anything added to it. Some mornings, that was enough. Most mornings, if you let yourself look, it was more than enough. It was the thing itself.